När ett barn blir allvarligt sjukt behöver du hantera en ny vardag. Men det finns stöd att få. Ronald McDonald Hus ger familjer möjligheten att bo tillsammans medan barnet vårdas på sjukhus. Vill du ge fler familjer samma möjlighet? Swisha till 970 22.
Om drömmar har en hemstad så heter den VM i fotboll. Sverige är nu en del av denna dröm och miljoner blågula hjärtan slår i exakt samma takt. Ladda ner Expect-appen och förstärk din VM-upplevelse med vår helt nya sportbok. Som ny spelare får du även en matchad bonus på upp till 1500 kronor. Välkommen till nya Expect. Åldersgräns 18 år, se regler och villkor på expect.se.
Today I'm speaking with Matthew Goodwin, who's a professor of politics at the University of Kent. His latest book, National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy, is written together with political scientist Roger Eatwell, is one of the best books to read if one wants to understand contemporary Europe, I would argue. And I'm glad to say he recently joined Substack, and I highly recommend giving him a follow on mattgoodwin.substack.com if you're interested in political issues, especially in Britain. The last week or so, I've been embroiled in a debate on Twitter and in Dagens Nyheter over whether the Sweden Democrats are fascist or not, which is a debate that never seems to go away. So I've been wanting to get Matt on the podcast for quite some time, but it's just a happy coincidence that we timed our talk with the debate I'm having over fascism. So I begin by asking him how one can distinguish between national populism and fascism. We also talk about the implosion of the Conservative Party in Britain, about wokeism and what to do about it, and why Generation Zoom or Generation Z seems to go left in the Anglosphere, but to the right in Sweden. I hope you enjoyed the program. You're listening to Rak Höger with me, Ivar Arpi. So I'm delighted to have Matthew Goodwin on the podcast. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you for having me.
So I read your book that you wrote together with Roger Eatwell a couple of years ago, National Populism, and it was that one was when the thought was one that I should interview you. But it's been a long time in the making, and we've been mailing back and forth for a while to get it sorted out when it will be appropriate. But in that book, I just wanted to start there because what I found very refreshing was that you made a case that national populism is not the same as fascism or right-wing extremism. So what we're seeing is not an explosion of, because back then and still it's common to see that the argument being made that what we're seeing now with the election of Meloni in Italy and Sweden Democrats in Sweden is a rebirth of fascism. And what you did in that book was to argue that that's not really the case. So I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit about that. So can you distinguish between national populism and fascism, and how?
Yeah, sure. Well, just by way of introduction, I came through the academic literature in my 20s, which really spent a lot of time looking at the rise of populism historically and today. And it's fair to say that literature tends to be dominated heavily by academics who are more to the left than maybe your average academic. So in the 90s, there was a very, I think, widespread consensus that it was acceptable to refer to these parties as neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, far right. And then as the debate matured and people began to, I think, accept that actually there was something different about these parties, then that debate began to become more nuanced. And And I think there is now an acceptance that actually, particularly from the 1980s, 1990s onwards, that many of these parties are really not comparable to interwar fascists for a number of reasons. I mean, the first is we need to remember just how revolutionary fascism was. And fascism was an explicitly revolutionary ideology that wanted to overthrow democracy, wanted to overthrow liberalism, was almost just as hostile towards capitalism. It looked forward in wanting to regenerate the nation, which it argued should be racially, ethnically pure, and that the nation should be embodied in the idea of the new man, that the new man would become the symbol of this national rebirth or palingenesis. And so fascism, really was at its core a revolutionary movement that had very little time at all for the frameworks of democracy and liberal democracy. National populism today is really not like that. If anything, it is more reactionary than revolutionary. It looks back to a golden age, which it argues has now passed. It doesn't really spend too much time looking forward and trying to carve out where it wants to take society. It's broadly accepting of democracy, capitalism, and many aspects of liberal society. You can see that in the positioning of people like Marine Le Pen and Giorgia Meloni. They're no longer even calling to leave the European Union. They are broadly accepting of aspects of diversity within their society. They're certainly not demanding the overthrow of political institutions. And I think that all of that really is a reminder, firstly, of the success that democracy has had in taming many of these parties. Also, secondly, the power of social norms in constraining what these parties are able to do. And thirdly, I think the extent to which post-war generations have become very sensitive and are increasingly sensitive to accusations of racism and discrimination. The one thing, however, that is worth remembering is while these parties are now operating within the framework of democracy, it is still true that they advocate a different conception of democracy. They are, at their core, direct democrats. They believe in majoritarian democracy. They want to assert the popular will of a people who they argue are uncomplicated, monolithic, pure, are characterized by common sense against this distant, corrupt, self-serving elite. So they are arguing for a different conception of democracy, one that arguably has more in touch with democracy as it was once known in ancient Greece than liberal conceptions of democracy, which are much more focused on individualism and minority rights. So, they still challenge the essence of democracy, but they are also fundamentally central to it. I mean, I think you can't have populism without democracy, and you can't have democracy without populism for reasons we may come on to discuss. They are intimately entwined, but populism, national populism, is different from historic fascism.
So now, if one want to be unfair, you could say that one is trying to paint over the disturbing aspects of this movement that you can see across across the continent. So if you, for example, accept that your definition then of national populism, one criticism has been made when similar arguments have been made here in Sweden, at least, is that, okay, so you're trying to hide the fascism. Why can't you just call it for what it is? If it walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck, it's still a duck. And what do you say to that then? Is it like are we just trying to find a new word for something that's really at its core fascism, but just like with a new let's have done a makeover that has dressed up in a suit and a tie, so to speak?
Well, no, my point is that it isn't walking like a duck and it doesn't look like a duck. I mean, I think the movements are quite different. That's not to say national populists do not attract individuals who harbor fascist neo-Nazi tendencies, and speaking to somebody in Sweden, you'll be more than aware of the origins of Sweden Democrats, and you'll be more than aware of the tendency for these parties to attract the 5 to 10% of radical extremists within society. But ideologically, historically, I do view many of these parties, not all of them, but many of them, as being qualitatively distinct from fascism. There are always exceptions. Golden Dawn in Greece, for example, would be one. We've had parties here in Britain, the British National Party, which explicitly was rooted in a tradition of neo-Nazism and didn't really make much of an attempt to hide it. But national populism as an ideology, I do think sits on a different branch of the tree from historic fascism. As I say, even if you look at Giorgia Meloni, even if you look at what she's saying about capitalism, what she's saying about the European Union, what she's saying about financial markets, actually, at its core, this is a movement that has largely accommodated itself to key pillars of the status quo. It is not a movement that is actively calling for the overthrow of democracy, liberalism, and capitalism, which the fascists were very explicit at doing. Now, of course, my colleagues and friends on the left might say this is all part of a deliberate ruse to conceal their true ideology and their true aspirations to evolve into parties of that nature. But I remain to be convinced. I spent much of my early career interviewing many people who had become actively involved in populist parties, and I've spent many, many years surveying supporters of populist parties. And actually, while it's certainly true they do attract a minority of people who, for example, hold very ethnically defined conceptions of what the nation state is about, who are explicitly prejudiced in how they think about minority groups, more often than not, you find the majority of voters who are drawn to these parties actually distance themselves from many of those views and attitudes. And I think for all liberal Democrats, this is the ultimate challenge, the balancing act of keeping these people within the system and ensuring they listen to the better angels of their nature, while at the same time calling out instances and movements and politicians and others who do deliberately violate democratic norms or norms of human rights. And that is the ongoing tension that exists within European and Western politics today. But as I say, I view national populism as a distinctive tradition in its own right that is quite different from historic fascism.
And so if you discuss the question, the issue of democracy, then is that the argument being made by national populists is that they want more democracy. And as you state in your book and here in the podcast, is that they are often more for more democracy and more referendums, bringing politics closer in like a Swiss style of democracy, bringing politics closer to the people and letting voters decide more matters. So that's one picture that, and for example, if you look at the representativeness of the parliament in Sweden and the voters on certain issues, you can see that when it comes to migration and integration, there's been a large gap between how the politicians on the national level view these issues and how their voters view these issues. And now, since the Sweden Democrats have entered the parliament, you can see that gap is basically non-existent. So you could say one view is that these parties want more democracy and they want more people to have more influence on politics and over more issues. But the other argument is that they are a threat to democracy, and it's like a Rorschach test. It's basically very hard to both be they are pro-democracy or they are against democracy. And so, what's your view on that?
Well, I think these parties are advocating a different conception of democracy that wants to prioritize the majority will against elites and minorities, especially on issues around the nation state, culture, and belonging. But let me just reflect on this issue of representation before coming back to your question. One of the fundamental problems we have across Western democracies today is that many people do not believe that representative democracy is what the first word implies, representative. The blunt reality across much of Europe and North America is that most of our national parliaments are overwhelmingly dominated by a university-educated minority, by middle-class professionals and by politicians who, as the research shows quite clearly, tend to lean much further to the left on cultural questions around migration, multiculturalism, diversity, and who often do not also match the economic interests of voters. And there's a large academic literature on this, books like Diploma Democracy, White Collar Government, among others, that have shown that there is this sharp and widening gulf between the rulers on the one hand and the ruled on the other. And the reason that matters, why don't we want an educated elite running the world? The reason that matters is because it's also shown to come with what scholars have called the exclusion bias within political systems, which is that they do not deliver policies that represent the wider community. They tend to deliver policies that represent the university-educated minority. They tend to pursue policies that are softer on issues around migration or illegal migration. They tend to pursue economic policies that are not fair for left-behind workers. They don't really pursue more radical reforms that might make the economy more balanced, or which might actually appeal as much to the values of these voters as to the values of social liberals in the cities. And I do think actually this issue of representation really lies at the heart of this populist paradox that we are witnessing in Western democracies, which is on the one hand, we have very strong levels of support for democracy, but on the other hand, we have growing levels of support for parties like Sweden Democrats, Brothers of Italy, and National Rally in France. And I think it's simply because it's just one of the drivers, but it's an important one. Many voters do not feel that their voice is reflected in political institutions. And even beyond politics, they do not feel that their voice is represented in many other institutions in society. For example, media, creative industries, cultural institutions, museums, galleries, publishing houses, films, television. And the reason that I talk about these institutions, and I do in my new book that's coming out next year, is because these are the institutions that ultimately determine the conversation about who we are. They determine the conversation about who we are as a country and what we believe. And if they too are dominated by the same groups, you're left with a large number of voters who not only say, look, I'm not even in this representative democracy, but I'm also not even in this national conversation. I'm not in the public square. And this is a fertile breeding ground for populists who campaign to prioritize the culture, the interests, and the voice of a people who they say are being excluded. So one challenge for Liberal Democrats is to find ways to include the voice of these voters, to ensure that they're not tempted and pulled over to the extremes, which is why I think we're now beginning to have a more serious debate about deliberative democracy, why we're beginning to have a serious debate about the use of referendums, why we're having a serious debate about actually reforming institutions so we can get some of these voices into politics. So to go back to your question, when, Margaret Canavan, who was a very influential academic for me, she was writing in the 90s, she made the argument in her essay, The Two Faces of Populism, which I still ask my students to read because I think it's one of the most seminal pieces. She says, look, at the heart of populism and at the heart of this challenge is a tension between the politics of faith and the politics of pragmatism. And the problem with democracy is that it's a constant balance between the two. And the politics of pragmatism is technocracy, it's bureaucracy, it's the professionalization of politics. It's focus groups, it's opinion polls, it's spin doctors, it's slick communication, it's listen to the experts. The politics of faith is emotion, it's passion, it's ideology, it's take back control, it's make America great again. It's about reinstilling a sense of national salvation. It's about reinstilling a voice for the people over and above the voice of experts. And there isn't one or the other. They're constantly in tension. And so Canavan was basically saying that when you have the rise of populism, yes, there is implicitly a threat to democracy that you need to take seriously, but it is a threat to liberal conceptions of democracy. But what you also have is a silver lining, because what these parties are doing is reminding the system that actually it has lost sight of a large number of voters that it needs to correct. It needs to self-correct in order to put their interests and their voice back into the public square. And that's a challenge that we're facing at the moment, which is how do you do that in a responsible democratic way?
I mean, one of the criticisms against this expertocracy or meritocracy is also has been leveled from the left, that you actually have what you're saying here as well, that people have different interests. You cannot, as an expert, conclude that the nation, this is best for the nation or the whole of the economy. But there are actually left behind workers, so to speak, who lose proportionally more when in a globalized economy than the middle classes in the big cities.
Well, let me give you a real world example of that, just while we're having this little discussion. Let's consider Britain's Labour Party. So on the one hand, you've seen a complete collapse in the number of working class non-graduate members of parliament in the Labour Party, even though the working class still represents about 33% of the country, and about 60% of people still say in Britain they feel working class, right? It's still a big part of the country. But only 1% of Labour MPs come from a working class background. Over 90% now belong to the graduate class, and about half of those went to Oxford or Cambridge. Okay, so the profile of representatives has completely changed. But also, as scholars have shown, people like Tom O'Grady, among others, under New Labour during the Tony Blair and the Gordon Brown years, those very same MPs simply looked at democracy and acted in democracy in a very different way. They supported welfare cuts for people who had lost their jobs. They didn't do the big economic reforms that were needed. New Labour presided over some of the highest rates of inequality that have ever been recorded. And I would also argue culturally, they lost touch with the country by presiding over a new policy on migration, which alienated large numbers of their own voters and which set the stage for Brexit. So you can see how actually this point can have profound political effects, because if you no longer have political systems that are responsive or which have been dominated by the sort of Brahmin left, a kind of liberal graduate cosmopolitan class, then actually, it's an open goal for populists. So the point about representation here, I do think, is an absolutely critical one. But again, it isn't only about politics, it is also about media. And give you another example briefly. You take how the media conversation has changed about politics. We no longer have local media, regional media. Those have increasingly been hollowed out. Most of our journalists now go straight from Oxford or Cambridge into the newsroom. 93% of our journalists are university graduates, and again, over half of them have gone to Oxbridge. How can they be in touch with the communities that exist in other parts of the country? And how can they give voice to groups that come from very different backgrounds? So it isn't only about what happens in Westminster or Washington or Paris or Rome or Berlin. It is also about what is happening in the national conversation. And that, I think, is why these voters have also been pushing back to the extent that they have.
Well, I would want to push back a little bit against the narrative that there are two, now I just forgot the name of the academic you just cited that inspired you. You have like you have the experts, and then you have the politics of passion.
Yeah, so she was riffing on Michael Oakeshott, but
she's probably right. But I would also say that when it comes to certain issues, the experts have in Sweden at least didn't want to look into certain issues. So you had people citing science and wanting to have an expert discussion or a discussion based on facts, so to speak. And it wasn't about just feelings or passions when it came to migration, integration, multiculturalism, diversity. And on those issues, the experts were nowhere to be found. They didn't want to partake in that conversation, basically. So there's also been a lack of expertise in certain issues where the experts like, this issue is out of bounds. This is beyond the pale to even look into. So there's in those areas, the experts, so the expert class and the liberal cosmopolitan elite, they were the ones who were I would argue, more ruled by their emotions than the other side. So the populists actually had if you label that side, they had a good case that we are the ones who are rational, wanting to have a rational discussion based on science, and we want the experts. We have the experts, and we want this discussion. this has also been the case when it comes to other areas. When it comes to, the transgender issues, when it comes to equality between the sexes, it's been some of these discussions are the argument is that we must have a rational discussion on these issues. That argument has been made on what is called the populist right. It's not. There are other arguments as well, but so I would just push back a little bit on that. That they have some boundaries are being established by what you can call the mainstream parties or the cosmopolitan elites, and they say that these questions are not to be asked, and these issues are not to be debated, and these viewpoints are not acceptable.
Yeah, I don't think they're incompatible. I think, whether you're looking at people like Margaret Canavan or whether you're looking at other arguments by, Peter Mayer has talked about similar issues, about the extent to which politicians are now ruling the void as we've basically drifted into a much more technocratic brand of politics that is, reflected in institutions like, for example, the European Union, that clearly have a democratic deficit at the heart of those organizations, that ensure that if you hold values that contradict or undermine the dominant consensus, or some might say dominant orthodoxy, it is much more difficult for you to have those values represented within the institutions and political parties. So, an example may be the capacity or not of governments to actually bring about changes to domestic laws once they're in the European Union, for example, which is obviously is partly what motivated the Brexit vote. It was a sense among many Brits that actually on crunch issues facing the country, they were not able to influence what they saw as a technocratic supranational political class that was not willing to entertain an alternative. And that bred some real problems. COVID was certainly part of that, although obviously the UK could do what it wanted during the COVID pandemic. But even today, I think there is still a palpable sense among many voters that actually the political parties that are a legacy of the Industrial Revolution, the traditional left and right, are now reaching a point where they may not be able to hold together, as we're seeing in France and Italy and elsewhere, the traditional coalitions of voters that they were once able to hold together. And it's difficult to see how, if at all, some of those parties can put that genie back into the bottle now that it's come out. If you look at Sweden, and you'll know this better than me, but if you look at the extent to which some of the mainstream party electorates have changed over the last 10, 20 years, it has been quite profound. And if you look at who's been voting for these new populist parties, usually it is an assortment of working class voters who used to vote for the right or the left, but often it's lots of people who never voted at all, or had voted but then had given up on the political system and then came back in to express their values, which they felt were not on the agenda. So anyway, I think that's broadly where we are in terms of representation, and it raises a challenge. It puts down a gauntlet to mainstream parties and also the media and creative industries, which is how can you better give voice to these voters? And that's the challenge we face. And
when the Brexit vote came, and people, it was like the working to a lot degree, the people who we've been talking about, the forgotten voters, or the people who had given up on politics but came back to vote for Brexit, and it was a surprise for many that Brexit, the Brexit side won. And now, and you could also see that what you've been writing on your Substack, that I'll post a link to, is that the Conservative vote also got a boost from these voters, and the red wall, it's called in the traditionally working class areas where the people vote Labour. Now many of them shifted to the Tories for a couple of years ago, and I think Boris Johnson basically welcomed them in an awkward way, that you're not usually, well, we will keep your trust, but he acknowledged that we received new voters, but we are not, this is not the usual voters for us. But now, as you write on your Substack, this vote is disappearing again, and they're shifting back to Labour. So what is happening there?
After the vote for Brexit, British politics was pushed into a state of realignment. And by realignment, I mean a change in the dominant political party or set of ideas that control the system. And we've had realignments throughout political history and in every country, from the rise of Roosevelt in America to Ronald Reagan to the rise of Thatcherism and then Tony Blair in Britain. Realignments fundamentally change the contours of the system. Brexit pushed Britain into a realignment. The question then was whether the Conservative Party wanted to pick up that realignment and run with it. And so between 2016 and 2019, they hoovered up record numbers of working class, non-graduate, older voters who had often voted for Brexit, did not agree with the Labour Party, especially under Jeremy Corbyn. But it wasn't only about Brexit. It was about wanting to lower migration, restore national sovereignty, rebalance an economy away from London, away from financial services, away from the urban liberal graduates, away from globalization. And in some senses, then Brexit became a backlash to the reforms in Britain that began in 1979 with the rise of Margaret Thatcher and then accelerated during the years of New Labour. So Brexit was a correction to a system that had lost touch with a large number of people. The problem today is that the Conservative Party didn't really know what to do with those voters or was unwilling to do the things that would be necessary to keep those voters in the Conservative tent. For example, they've liberalized the immigration system even more. So yes, migration from within Europe has become much more restrictive, but migration from outside of Europe has become much more liberal. You can basically now enter the UK on a work visa with a job that pays £25,000, which is below the average salary in the country. They've loosened international student migration. They've loosened dependency migration, as in the relatives of students or workers.
It almost sounds like Boris Johnson was not Donald Trump after all. He was. Everybody said like, oh, look, he's a blonde guy who's leading Brexit, and it coincided in time with Trump's election, and everybody was like, oh no, he's the British Trump.
Let me come back to that point. Both Johnson and especially Liz Truss, our new Prime Minister, have doubled down on financial services, on London. They've removed a cap on bankers' bonuses. They try to push through sweeping tax changes for people who earn over £150,000 a year. And they've made it clear that they want to deregulate the economy and preside over a new liberal migration policy. In other words, they want to turn Britain, or Brexit Britain, into Davos-on-Thames. This is not what most Brexit voters wanted. And indeed, one of the fundamental miscalculations about Boris Johnson in much of the international media was that he was a genuine cultural conservative. He was not. I met Boris Johnson. I know the people around Boris Johnson. He is at heart an instinctive liberal who wants to, in fact, he's more a cosmopolitan than a liberal if you actually look at where he's come from and his life story. But because he was associated with Brexit, he then sort of fell into this rather bizarre global debate that we had with a lot of catastrophizing about Boris Johnson sort of undermining democracy, which was not at all a reflection of reality.
Trippelt välkommen tillbaka säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonald's. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonald's.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
And so anyway, where that leaves us today is here. If you voted for Brexit, then voted for Theresa May, then voted for Boris Johnson to try and get Brexit through, which you did, you have now been given a libertarian brand of conservative politics that basically wants to put the London-centric financial services model on steroids. So the 20% of the Brexit electorate, only ever a small minority, is now running the entire country, and the 80% of the Brexit electorate, who actually genuinely wanted to reshape the political economy of Britain, have arguably now been left behind again, which leads us to a very interesting question, I think, which is how does this find its political expression going forward in the years ahead? Because I will bet you my house that there is no way Liz Truss wins a big majority at the next general election, and that there will be lots of disillusioned voters, particularly on the right of the spectrum, saying, what happened to all of the things I was told I was going to get when I voted for Leave in 2016?
And this leads into what we've basically been talking about this, but today, when we record this, just before you published a new piece on your Substack with the title "The Space for a New Party in Britain," and what you're writing is that there's a divide because the parties. The Labour Party is too left wing on cultural issues for many people, and the Tories are too right wing in economical issues, which you went into now. And so there's a hole in British politics for people who are basically want the control back. The people who voted for Brexit, who wanted to take back control, so to speak, to Britain over migration and certain issues, and they want also they're not against the NHS, which is a big national health services, which is a big issue in Britain if it works, and they're willing to pay taxes, they're willing to pay for welfare, so they are not really right wing in the traditional sense, but they are most definitely right wing in the new sense, on the new issues. Do you really think we will have a third party in Britain, or will it be expressed in some other form, this discontent?
I think because of our electoral system, our first past the post system, it is incredibly difficult for any new party to break through. One of the ironies of Brexit is the only reason Brexit was possible was because Nigel Farage used the European Parliament elections to win representation and boost his visibility. Without European Parliament elections, Britain would never have ended up voting for Brexit because no populist challenger would ever have broken through. But the point that I'm trying to make in this piece is actually, if you look at the dynamics of public opinion, there is ample demand for a party that basically leans a little bit left on the economy and a little bit right on culture. And it was often said in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum that it is easier for the right to move left on the economy than it is for the left to move right on culture. And the argument was that by leaning into some of the economic reforms that Boris Johnson lent into, levelling up, increasing tax to support the National Health Service and social care, investing in infrastructure, alongside Brexit, alongside immigration reform, he'd be able to hold this coalition together. In the end, that turned out not to be the case. Johnson was just way too liberal to do that. Liz Truss now is leaning further to the right on the economy and is arguably embracing the old consensus on culture. She's not going to take on the European courts to deal with the small boats that are crossing the English Channel. She's not going to impose a limit, a sustainable limit on migration. I suspect 2 or 3 years from now, our net migration levels will go from where they are at the moment, which is 250,000 per year. That's 250,000 more people coming in than leaving, to, I would estimate, somewhere between 350,000 and 500,000 a year would be my guess. And all of this is going to, I think, fuel what we're seeing in the polls already, and what I've written about. And these are not just, these are very reliable projects. I mean, the British Social Attitude Survey is the most reliable source of data in Britain, and it shows quite clearly that what's happened over the last 6 years is that our divide between Leave and Remain, the Brexit divide, has not faded. It's just been replaced by new proxy battles, which are now over the small boats and illegal migration, gender politics, transgender issues, minority rights, how we think of Britishness, how we think of our history, and these proxy battles.
So how because that's also because one of the issues in Britain has been like who's proper British? Like, do you have to be white English? Do you have to be white to be British? And what you say in that piece is that it used to have more of that. People used to think that to a larger degree, and now, even though you might be a Brexiteer or you might be part of this new group that are wanting to take back control over the borders, less migration, that doesn't translate into like that racial conception of Britishness. At least you argue that.
Well, if you look at every voter in Britain today, I mean, the vast majority have become very supportive of a more inclusive definition of Britishness. Only about 3% of the country think that you need to be white to be British. So, you know, when we talk about national identity, we often talk about ethnic and civic conceptions of identity, which is a little bit simplistic. But in essence, what's happened is that over the last 50 years, the British have basically become less focused on issues around race and have become much more focused on issues around a sort of civic view of Britishness, which is about respecting institutions, upholding the rule of law,
mourning the Queen,
and so on and so on. But that is not to say there are not divides beneath the surface, and there are big divides. So if you voted for Brexit or Boris Johnson, your conception of Britishness is about, you know, saying actually ancestry is important, being born in the country is important. Sharing traditions is important. Sharing culture is important. Sharing myths and memories is important. And feeling British is important. Now, what makes those voters nervous is the extent to which certain members of the elite are trying to redefine Britishness and Englishness as simply being about the celebration of multiculturalism and diversity, whereby national identity becomes a celebration of international themes, right? Of universalism, of individualism, of multiculturalism. And what you tend to find is the Brexiteer and the Boris Johnson voters and the traditionalist voters are saying, look, I'm open to some immigration, but I want moderate immigration, and I don't want to lose or sacrifice the distinctive aspects of my national identity on the altar of liberal cosmopolitanism. They're saying they want to spend as much time celebrating what is distinctive about British identity than more international themes around fairness, tolerance, diversity. They're not saying those aren't important, but they're saying, I also want to celebrate who we are as a country, right? And that is not about a crude, aggressive form of nationalism. It is about ensuring that we can cultivate a national identity that allows traditionalists to feel that they are being respected and that they are being recognized, but which also encourages newcomers and minorities to blend into that shared sense of national identity. That, you know, as you will have seen in the news, we've recently had some disturbances in the northern town of Leicester between young Muslim and Hindu men who are clearly holding ideas around so-called communalism, who clearly do not want to integrate locally. The things I'm talking about are urgent, right? We need to construct a shared sense of national identity that can harness both traditionalists and cosmopolitans, as well as the rising number of minorities within the country. And what worries me, to be frank, about members of what you might call a kind of liberal cosmopolitan class is they are so preoccupied with diversity and multiculturalism that they really don't grasp the fact that they are fanning the flames by alienating many voters who say, look, there's more to this. There's more to me than this celebration of diversity. In fact, Francis Fukuyama has made a very similar point in Identity when he says, his book Identity, he says, look, saying that a country is welcoming of migration, saying a country is welcoming of diversity is fine. But it's also like saying you don't have any identity of your own, right? And if your only identity is about welcoming others, then who are you? What is your instrumental, unique, distinctive sense of identity? And that's where many voters, I think, are falling adrift, coming adrift from many of their leaders who they feel have lost sight. And ultimately that too was partly what Brexit was all about.
There's a lot to unpack, but I just wanted to hear your opinion on Sweden Democrats when it comes to this, when we were talking about the new space for a third party in Britain, because they have captured a lot of the working class voters. They are among working class men in Sweden, they are the largest party. And they are I think they are about the same size as the Social Democrats, which traditionally has gathered all of the working class voters, basically. And they have also declined to define themselves as a right-wing or left-wing party themselves, even though in the media, we have been very keen on labeling them as far-right or extreme right or populist right, but they themselves have declined to do that. And the party leader, Jimmy Åkesson, was very firm on that before the election, that we are not a right-wing party. Nevertheless, they have moved to the right on certain economical issues, and they are now in the process of they will form or be part of or be the supporting a right-wing government. So how do you think, is that like a trap for them, or so to speak? Because how can you maintain that you're not a right-wing party, and how can you maintain that you have your more left-wing economical ideas when you're collaborating with a right-wing government, which is most definitely firmly liberal, conservative, and has roots in more in Thatcherite views on economy?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is the electoral logic of national populist parties is that they, for fairly obvious reasons, don't want to be branded right or left, because they are often drawing their support from across the spectrum. I mean, many of the people that are voting for them, as you say, either used to vote for the left or sometimes more recently have voted for the right. And so there's partly a positioning issue here. But secondly, what we're looking at across Europe today, not just in Sweden, I think, is almost a new generation of national populists that don't really fit into the traditional left-right divide, like in some ways they used to. You know, I remember looking at these parties, at least through my academic research in the 80s and the 90s, and many of them were just unbridled Thatcherites on the economic axis. Many of them were very comfortable with the free market. They weren't really that bothered about economics. You go back and you look at Jean-Marie Le Pen, he talked a lot about communism, migration, but he didn't really talk all that much about economics. Now, fast forward to today, and I think what we are seeing is a rise of a new generation who kind of understands, they might genuinely believe it, I don't know, but they certainly understand that there is much more political space to be had by leaning simultaneously into the left on the economy, by trying to attack left-wing parties on issues around redistribution, workers' rights, and on the other hand, leaning into the right-wing parties by turning up the volume on migration, on asylum, on violence, crime, Islamism, etc., etc. And so that sort of has given them this sweet spot in political systems where it's quite difficult then for mainstream parties to respond to them. The Sweden Democrats obviously have gone on a long journey, a long history. I am aware of their beginnings. I remember doing some work on them a long time ago and being quite struck, firstly, at just how extreme their roots were, but secondly, also accepting of the fact, and I think some Swedish political scientists and political sociologists wrote this at the time in the early 2000s, that if you looked at Sweden, while people like Jean-Marie Le Pen and Gianfranco Fini and Jörg Haider were doing well in Europe at the time, if you looked at Sweden, the old argument was Sweden was immune to populism because it was historically liberal and it had strong mainstream parties. But actually, even by the early 2000s, people were arguing that the conditions were ripe for a party like Sweden Democrats because levels of party identification or loyalty between voters and the mainstream parties were collapsing. The unions were much weaker. Inequality was beginning to rise. So you kind of had this sort of toxic mix that was already there before Sweden then obviously had this much more recent debate about.
I'm just going to add there that the migration levels were increasing a lot during the early 2000s and throughout. So,
well, that's very consistent with the European picture. I mean, one of the big myths about national populism is that it's not related to migration levels. All the evidence shows the opposite, actually. The moment you start to have increasing migration levels, typically support for these parties tends to track that. There are some exceptions. Eastern Europe would be the obvious one. Hungary is an obvious one. But actually, if you look at overall demographic flows, they tend to correspond quite closely with support for populism.
One issue is that has some bearing on this is how the Generation Z or the Zoomers, how they will vote and where they are situated in the political landscape. And you wrote a piece, Meet the Zoomers, why Generation Z looks set to deliver another cultural revolution. And what struck me was that the Anglo-Saxon in the Anglosphere, the youth and the Generation Z, they look very dissimilar from the same generation in Sweden, because when you look at the young people here, they are much more right-wing on many of the issues. So they are the moderate party, like Tories. They are the largest party among first-time voters, and Sweden Democrats is huge. And so if it was up to young people in Sweden, it will be a landslide for the conservative right-wing parties. And there's something strange happening because if you look at the numbers from in your piece, it's the opposite.
Well, I guess one question I'd have for you is, have you run the education divide on that? So what you tend to find is Zoomer graduates are basically drifting very quickly leftwards. It may not be the case in Sweden, I don't know, but in the UK, we find now remarkably about 80% of Zoomer graduates are basically leaning left and have become much more likely to do so. And that wasn't always the case. This has basically happened since 2015. So, and women, young female Zoomer graduates are way more liberal than their male counterparts. So there's something really interesting going on. Now, of course, you need to take this with a pinch of salt. There are a few things that we need to keep in mind. One is differential turnout rate. So older boomers are about 30 points more likely to vote than younger Zoomers. There are life cycle effects. Even though they're starting off from such a liberal position, they will always be more liberal than their predecessors, but they may come down a few notches as they go through their life cycle and become a little bit more conservative, which the evidence suggests they will. So those things should also be considered. And also don't lose sight of some of the other shifts that are happening in American politics and elsewhere. We are now seeing new generations of working class, non-graduate minority voters, Hispanic, Latino in Britain, watch British Indians over the next 10 years, who are actually quite socially conservative on issues around identity, belief in the nation, abortion, borders, and those issues put them actually closer to the right than the left. So the point I'm saying is there is a narrative on the left, which is basically demography is destiny. If you put the Zoomers with the minorities and the middle-class professionals, you basically have an ascendant coalition. And this argument has long been made on the left of politics. Reality is much more complex, right? I mean, you can look at a number of other cases. Marine Le Pen in France, very popular among young, non-graduate French people, typically working in hospitality, hotels, restaurants, often, struggling with the cost of living, but also concerned about their relative decline compared to other groups in society. If you look at Giorgia Meloni's support, there's no real sharp age gradient there. It's concentrated in the working class, but there's no real sharp age gradient. So this might be an Anglo-American phenomenon. Then this might be a kind of UK-US story. Primarily, it may not yet be as prominent in parts of Europe, but I bet if you were to look at that education divide, even in Sweden, you'd find some profound differences.
Yeah, the gender divide is very pronounced. That's the most. Men and women are voting more dissimilar than ever before in Sweden. So and among young people as well. So that is there, and the education is there, but it's not as strong as the Sweden Democrats are weaker among educated, but they have made inroads in all categories. Basically, the oldest cohort, the boomers, are more left wing than the young people in Sweden. So there's if people died when they were 65, we would have had a right wing government. They would have had a much more of a advantage over the left wing. So there's some. But what I find disturbing in the Anglosphere is the woke politics, and how that, as you've been talking about, how that influences so much. And like how do you have any? How can a political party work against the wokeism taking over institutions without doing an overreach that will go too far in inhibiting liberal democracy? I mean, do you have your formula, or have you seen any party being able to do that?
Well, so the first thing I just wanted to point out is that when we talk about wokeism, in my mind, what we're talking about is radical progressivism. So we're talking about radical progressive politics. And I do view, unlike some of my colleagues, I do view radical progressives as a distinctive group in politics. I think they are quite different from what we might call moderate liberals. And I think the evidence really backs me up on that. Conceptually and empirically, they just see the world in a very different way. They're overwhelmingly supportive, passionately so, of immigration, of minority rights, of cosmopolitanism. They're the least likely to feel proud of their country, to feel attached to group identities. They are consumed by the issues around historic injustices, the need to revisit history, arguably the need to delegitimize history and identity. And they are also much more supportive of restrictive speech codes in trying to advance their cause. So they are more supportive, really, of the old Herbert Marcuse view that essentially silencing some voices is acceptable in the pursuit of social justice. I've been doing surveys on academics, for example, in the top 10 universities around the world, where you find these views are generally concentrated, and you can see quite clearly that there is a considerable degree of political intolerance of people that hold different views and beliefs. There is clearly a willingness among a visible minority, I'd stress minority, but it is visible, very visible, to discriminate against people who do not share or subscribe to radical progressive values. And there is also a very visible acknowledgement on the other side of the debate among conservatives, gender-critical scholars, moderate liberals even, that they now need to self-censor their voice when they're within these institutions. They need to hide their real views. All the evidence on that, I think, backs me up, and I'd be happy to debate anybody who thinks otherwise. So radical progressives are a distinctive group. What do we do about radical progressives? Well, I think in a sense, the first thing that we need to do is communicate and showcase how radical their views are relative to other members of the community. So on Twitter and elsewhere, regularly, I am constantly sharing survey findings and polls. I did one yesterday showing just how adrift progressives are from the views of average voters. That's one point, which is visibility and awareness. The second is for left-wing parties is to acknowledge and grasp the fact that these activists may not be helping your cause. There's no point piling up votes in the cities and the university towns if these activists are simultaneously alienating many of the voters you need to win elections. And there's a big debate going on in the US at the moment about this, where you can see very serious data-heavy analysts making the point that if you want to understand why non-graduate white working class voters and Latino Hispanics are leaving the Democrats, you need to understand the impact of radical progressivism on Democrat politics. You know, ideas like defund the police, a very divisive identity politics, renaming groups, revisiting the beginnings of the country, calling for reparations, etc., etc. These are ideas that are generally not shared by, you know, the average voter that just wants to talk about economic reform and how to make the world a better, more prosperous place. So there's an electoral dynamic to it as well, which I think will become more apparent as we go forward. And thirdly, when you get to the point where we are now with some institutions like universities, where the monoculture, the ideological monoculture is so strong, I do think at that point in time, we all have a duty to consider whether actually the state should intervene to try and make those institutions more responsive and more accepting of viewpoint diversity. So one of the things, for example, I've been working on in the UK with colleagues of mine is the Higher Education Academic Freedom Bill, which is passing through Parliament at the moment. And under that piece of legislation, and I'm historically very averse to using the state in any aspect of life. I mean, I wouldn't describe myself as a classical liberal, but my instinct is not to turn to the state. But having seen so many of my colleagues be sacked, dismissed, and harassed, I came to the conclusion reluctantly that we needed some legislation to look at that. And this piece of legislation will actually make it, will actually create a new duty on universities to promote academic freedom and viewpoint diversity and provide a mechanism, a new office that people can turn to if they feel they're being persecuted because of their political beliefs. And universities could be fined if it is shown that they are harassing or discriminating against colleagues and students because of their political beliefs. I'm sorry to say that I think we're here, but I do think we're here. And I think something like that is needed, because when you've been observing, as we have been in the UK, cases like Kathleen Stock, who challenged gender identity theory and was basically intimidated to such an extent that she left her job at the University of Sussex. Or if you are people, there are many cases in the UK of academics who have been removed or have basically been forced to leave their jobs. We need to do something about that. So I think this third area of, and this is especially difficult for conservatives to think about, but is it time to reflect on how we can use the state and other bodies to intervene to limit the reach of radical progressivism?
Yeah, and that's the challenge now for the new government in Sweden. These kinds of reform. I've written a lot about academic freedom in Sweden, and you have a very explicit politicization and ideologicalization of when it comes to gender ideology, diversity, and you have these policies that universities have to implement in Sweden, and it's out in the open. Like you have political aims that the university should fulfill, but it's been from the left, and so now. The right, as you say, as a classical liberal, you want the state out of it. But if you do that, if you vacate the space for and you just let these policies be in place, then you're not helping the situation. So you have to replace these policies with something else. And the issue is to do it in a way that you're not in another way inhibiting academic freedom or making it worse for academics. We're specifically talking about universities, but there are other areas as well.
Well, I think the debate that we will all be having increasingly over the next 5 to 10 years will be the politicization of public sector organizations. That will be the debate that we're having. And I'm not just referring to universities, I'm referring to schools, to primary, to secondary schools, what we're teaching children about race, sex, and gender, police organizations, healthcare organizations. There is a growing debate, as we can see in America, about the politicization of public sector organizations, and that will become much more pressing. One of the legacies of COVID, for example, was not just that we were all sat at home with our families. It was also that for many people, they were suddenly made aware of what is happening in schools and what children are being taught about these issues. And I can tell you in the UK, that debate is becoming very live as parents are realizing that children as young as 4 or 5 are being taught about masturbation, about sort of sexual fetishes, are being exposed to things that many parents feel they should not be being exposed to. And my concern here, and I'm happy to be unpopular for being the person that's putting their head above the parapet to say it, is that in these institutions, some of the radically progressive ideas are going to collide with the more conservative instincts of many ordinary voters, and that is going to become a very, very difficult place to be. I don't want to see schools being segregated. I don't want to see homeschooling, and I don't want to see new universities being set up because the old ones are considered to be too political. We need to all be in the same public square together. We need to be debating and discussing together. I don't want to see Britain or any other society become America, where this is now a part of life, homeschooling and parallel institutions. I don't want to see that. But that means we need the moderates in the room to stand up and take on radicals on all sides. And getting moderates to stand up is not easy, because nobody wants to be called a bigot. Nobody wants to be called a transphobe. Nobody wants to be called a racist. Nobody wants to be having these social norms thrown at them because they can end careers, right? They can get you cancelled. But unless we can get moderates to stand up and say, actually, I don't think it's acceptable that young children are being told that they should be moved onto puberty blockers and that they should be pushed down this ideological tunnel with or without their parents, I don't think that is a particularly healthy place to be. And I think we should be able to have a mature adult conversation about it without getting worried about people screaming us down on Twitter. And that unfortunately is where we're going, unless we can try and create the framework for a much more sensible, grown-up conversation about what's happening in our institutions.
Thank you very much, Matthew Goodwin, for being part of Rak Höger.
Thank you for having me.
Och stort tack till dig som har lyssnat. Gå gärna in och skriv en recension på Apple Podcasts eller i den app där du lyssnar på podden. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden. Och den som prenumererar där kan även ta del av de texter jag skriver. Gillar man det man läser och hör får man gärna bli betalande prenumerant för 5 euro i månaden eller 50 om året. Då får man ta del av lite exklusivt extra material också. Du hittar rubbet på ivararpi.se. Och har du några frågor eller synpunkter kan du alltid mejla mig på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs igen.